Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Why is the Asian region the most disaster-prone area of the world? What is one organization doing to help reduce the risk of natural disasters? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. It seems that every area of the world has some type of disaster that happens periodically, but the Asian region is estimated it has the worst and some of the most devastating forms of natural disaster. Today we're going to take a look at why that area is suffering from this, and also what one group is doing to try to help ameliorate some of these problems. My guest today is an expert in this area. My guest today is Ms. Jainey Bavishi. Jainey Bavishi is the Executive Director of the Asia Pacific Disaster Risk Reduction and Resilience Network, commonly called APDR3, that is based in Honolulu, Hawaii. Ms. Bavishi has a master's degree in city planning from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and a bachelor's degree in public policy and cultural anthropology from Duke University. Jainey Bavishi, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thanks for having me, Bill.
I appreciate you being with me today. That's a long title. I can see why you go with that acronym APDR3. That's very good.
It's a mouthful.
It is. Let's talk about it, though. The Asia Pacific Disaster Risk Reduction and Resilience Network. What exactly is it? When was it formed? Why was it formed?
Sure. Well, the Asia Pacific Disaster Risk Reduction and Resilience Network, or as you mentioned, the APDR3 network, is a public-private partnership that is focused on basically building more resilient communities and economies in the Asia Pacific region that can anticipate risk, limit the impact, and recover quickly in the face of natural hazards. It was formed at the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, or APEC meetings in Honolulu in 2011. That was just after it was the same year, just after the great earthquake and tsunami in Japan, which happened earlier that year. A lot of our members were involved in the recovery and response after that particular disaster, and recognized the need for better coordination and collaboration between businesses, government, NGOs, and universities, and the military on disaster risk reduction and response and recovery. And so former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton actually also acknowledged this need and launched the APDR3 network at the APEC meetings.
So it was her idea, and it got launched, and it's rolling along right now.
It is. There were 9 member organizations that signed on to a statement of intent during those APEC meetings in 2011. And we've been convening organizations, getting thought leaders together, and now really exploring our own programmatic agenda as we move forward.
Now, are you a membership organization? You have corporations, you have governmental entities, what have you? Do you have individuals who are members, or how does that work?
No, at this time we have 12 organizational members. So yes, they include businesses, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, government agencies, universities, NGOs, and the military as well. We also have a few foundations involved, the Ford and Rockefeller Foundations. Mm-hmm.
And what services do you provide to your members? I know you're bringing the key players together who have a vested interest in this. Obviously, we all have an interest in these natural disasters.
Right.
But do you provide services to them? Or what types of services do you provide?
Sure. Well, right now I think we provide information, relationships, and a venue to really design some innovative ideas around disaster risk reduction. It's a forum for our members to explore opportunities to collaborate and leverage public and private resources, amplify their own activities in this space by partnering with other organizations that are working on these issues. As we continue to grow, we'll probably look at how we can improve our servicing our members. At this point, it's really a collaborative forum.
And how do you define disasters? Natural disasters, we see that the Asian area has certainly been hit with a large number of tsunamis. They've had earthquakes, just a variety of other things. The typhoon went through the Philippines not too long ago, but there have been all kinds of natural disasters. But do you categorize them, or how do you define a disaster?
That's a good question. So we do focus on natural hazards, not technological hazards or terrorist attacks or anything like that. And we focus on all natural hazards, whether they're earthquakes or tsunamis or floods or drought. But we're looking at both the disaster risk reduction aspect of it in terms of actually being able to reduce the damage from the disaster, but also we're looking at resiliency. And our definition of resiliency is to really focus on the ability of a community or economy to bounce back from a shock from a natural disaster. So I think that involves looking at the interconnections between the economic, environmental, and social systems in an area.
Is that what we mean by a cross-sectoral approach, that you're bringing everybody into it, everyone that have an interest in this, and you don't want to leave anybody out?
That's right. We're acknowledging that that disasters present pretty complex problems, and so we need to bring together businesses, governments, NGOs, international organizations to look at these problems together. Where it's going to take a partnership effort. It's going to take everyone to put their heads together and their resources together to really address these issues.
And when you bring these players together, do you do this through a conference type of arrangement, through workshops? Do you come together? Do you brainstorm? Do you produce a final publication and recommendations on what to do? Perhaps a how-to guide for governments on if you have another tsunami, such as one that hit, a horrific one that hit Japan a few years ago. Is all of that included in what you do, or is there more?
Well, we're doing three main things. We're serving as an internal coordinator for our members, which means that we look at ways that we can amplify each other's efforts. We can discover mutually supportive agendas. We can find places where we can leverage some public-private resources, reduce duplications as well. Secondly, we're serving as an intermediary. So that's where we bring all our members together with external partners that are working on these issues and really create a space for thought leaders to brainstorm some new collaborations and some new ideas and match needs with resources, whether they be financial resources or expertise. And then lastly, we want to be an innovator. We want to serve as a space to incubate innovation so we can test some new ideas and strategies, generate new knowledge, and then share those best practices in the field.
That's all three are very important, but the idea of innovation really grabs my attention. Are there some ideas that you're kicking around now that we're looking at how we view disasters and what we can do to help prepare for them before they happen, while they're happening, and after they happen? Are there some new ideas that are out there floating around? I know we build upon prior levels or layers of knowledge.
Right. No, that's exactly right. Well, we're working on a few different things. One is looking at technology. How can we use especially mobile technology, not just to get information out when a disaster is approaching, but more importantly, to educate people and help them learn how to prepare. Some of the most vulnerable areas to natural hazards are also some of the most remote areas and have the least capacity to know what to do in the face of a disaster. And so we were looking at Indonesia, for example, and there are more cell phones in Indonesia than there are people. And so even in some of these remote areas, there are the cell phones could be a way to reach people and provide them information on how to prepare. So that's one example of what we're looking at.
That's very, very important. It's extremely important to try to get the information to people before this happens. As you look back, are there any lessons that we've learned up to this point? I know this is a relatively new operation that you have, but we saw the cyclone that hit the Irrawaddy Delta several years ago. We've seen the areas in Sri Lanka that have been wiped out to a large degree. Banda Aceh, we could put a whole list out there probably, but are there certain lessons that we've learned from these previous disasters that we're incorporating today to help us avoid the loss of life, the loss of property, just on across the board? We can't stop them, obviously, but we can try to prepare a bit.
That's exactly right, and that's exactly what we're aiming to do. So for example, Typhoon Haiyan just hit the Central Philippines a few months ago. And we are working with our partners in the Philippines to, one, provide subject matter expertise on a variety of recovery planning and resiliency planning areas, to share best practices from from U.S. disasters and global disasters on best most effective recovery strategies. Of course, you can't apply anything wholesale in a different context, but you can learn from that and apply it in a culturally sensitive and context-specific way. And then finally, we want to be able to bring panels of experts together to troubleshoot on a particular problem. So, for example, if the Philippines decides to look at how to build infrastructure to provide flood protection for some of their most vulnerable communities, there's a lot of learnings on how to combine both the built infrastructure with ecosystem-based approaches that involve planting mangrove forests or building reefs that might provide suitable methods for protection in that particular area.
Mm-hmm. Do you also work with people who, we realize the climate is changing. There's no doubt about that. The debate is over. The scientific data just keeps piling up day by day by day, and we see that the glaciers are melting, the seas are rising, yet we continue in the United States and elsewhere around the world to build houses right at oceanfront level. And 10 years ago, it was probably fine. Not much was happening. 20 years ago, maybe not much was happening, but it's starting to accelerate now. Are you working with people to try to help them realize that there are certain things that we can do from the habitat standpoint, not to build in a flood plain or to not build in a certain area, or if an area has a fault line with an earthquake crack running right through it or something like that, to try to maybe build a town down the road 50 miles or something like that?
Well, a lot of those decisions are made at the local levels.
Right.
And so as a consortium of American-based institutions right now, that's not something that we necessarily control. However, what we're trying to do is share best practices, and create venues where those local leaders can share some of their challenges with other local leaders that are experiencing the same vulnerabilities and the same problems, so that they can learn from each other and then make appropriate decisions based on their local context.
Exactly right. Now, the United Nations has been involved in disaster relief for many years with OCHA, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and a variety of other groups. The one that comes to mind is the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, which is a major operation. It doesn't have a huge budget or a huge staff, but it still has tremendous outreach around the world. First off, what is the role of that office in relation to what you're doing, and how do you interact with it?
Well, we've mainly been interacting with the UN International Strategy for Disaster Reduction Office in Bangkok, which is the regional headquarters for the Asia-Pacific region. And they've actually played a major role in convening members and organizations who are working in the disaster risk reduction space across the entire region. So we've been plugging into those conversations and are looking to support their efforts to continue building more effective public-private partnerships.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is an independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. Today we're taking a look at natural disasters and one area of the world that gets hit with a large number, in fact a disproportionately large number of natural disasters, and that's the Asian area. My guest today is an expert on this issue. My guest today is Jainey Bavishi. Jainey Bavishi is the Executive Director of the Asia-Pacific Disaster Risk Reduction and Resilience Network, commonly called APDR3. Jainey, we're talking about Asia, and in the opening I mentioned that is the most disaster-prone area, natural disaster-prone area in the world, and I guess for logical reasons we could fathom very quickly. But what are some of the reasons that Asian area gets hit so hard? I know we're not geologists or climatologists, but what are some of the general reasons that we think that it's taking a tremendous hit?
Right, so as you mentioned, I'm not a scientist, but the Asia-Pacific region, it's located on the Pacific Ring of Fire and located in a particularly active tectonic region. And it's susceptible to just about every kind of hazard that you can imagine: earthquakes, floods, droughts, cyclones. Volcanoes, all of the above. And as you mentioned, it's the most economically vibrant region in the world, but also the most disaster prone. In 2011 alone, that region experienced about $300 billion in economic losses due to natural hazards. That year was the year of the Japan earthquake and tsunami, and also Southeast Asian floods that particularly impacted Thailand. But that number represented about 80% of the global economic losses from that year.
And that's one of the reasons, too, that businesses are getting much more involved. Insurance companies are getting much more involved. They have a financial stake in this. We all have a human stake, but they have a financial stake to a large degree. You're in New York this week.
Right.
And you were at a major conference, or rolling out of the Oceans and Seas concept that I think was being launched by, I believe, the former ambassador of Palau, Stuart Beck, and also Amir Dosal, who is the former director of the UN Office of Partnerships. And that was a major activity to get. What was the focus of that conference, and what was your role as a speaker or participant?
The focus of that conference was to propose that the preservation of healthy oceans and seas be a sustainable development goal post-2015. I think many people have recognized the importance of healthy oceans and seas in development and poverty alleviation, but it hasn't explicitly been called out in the Millennium Development Goals. And so that's what we were talking about. It was a really inspiring group of people that were there that really understood the importance of oceans and seas and the interaction between healthy oceans and seas and social development. My role was to participate on a panel that included perspectives from the financial sector, private sector, and civil society on the importance of healthy oceans and seas. It was a great mix of people that were there.
And what was your message to the group?
Well,
we probably have two or three, but
right,
one in particular.
Sure, it's very much aligned with what we're working on. In order to build resilience, we have to take a very interdisciplinary and multi-sectoral approach. And so these conversations and policy dialogues that are happening in the development circles, the climate circles, and the disaster risk reduction circles must be connected. And that's exactly what I think we were driving towards in that meeting.
And if our viewers would like to contact you, they could contact you at jainey.bavishi@uhfoundation.org.
That's right.
And send you a note and get more information about what you're doing. This is so critical. The oceans have certainly, we see every country has probably been adversely affected by climate change, but the oceans are certainly taking a tremendous blow as far as the pollution that's there. We see that many of the reefs are dying, they're bleaching out, that type of thing. We see more and more garbage and debris and plastic containers floating around. The fish stocks have been overfished, to be quite honest. So many of them are caught up in these huge nets. They don't only want certain types of fish. They throw the rest out and they die. How important is the whole concept of oceans to what you're doing, dealing with natural disasters, as far as factoring it in?
It's incredibly important. A lot of the natural disasters that we're focused on are climatological disasters like cyclones and droughts. And so we are very focused on the role of climate change, and we're also very aware that a lot of the communities that are the most vulnerable are also the most dependent on the resources that the ocean provides, whether it be fishing communities or tourism-based economies. And so, the oceans play a major role in what we're doing.
Exactly. Now, there's going to be a major United Nations conference coming up in March of 2015 in Sendai, Japan.
That's right.
And it's on disaster reduction, I guess, is what it is. What type of role will you play at that conference, and what would you like to see come out of that conference?
Well, we talked a little bit about the Sustainable Development Goals. There's another plan that the UN developed called the Hyogo Framework for Action. It was developed in 2005 at the second World Conference on Disaster Reduction. This one in 2015 will be the third conference on disaster risk reduction. And so we're hoping, and the plan is to develop the successor to the Hyogo Framework for Action that will create an updated plan for disaster risk reduction globally. Right now, there are a lot of multi-sectoral, multi-stakeholder consultations happening to gain input that will eventually help to develop and inform that plan. And so we're very involved in that process and helping to gather input that can inform that plan. We'll also be participating in the a regional conference that's happening in Bangkok in June, the Asian Ministerial Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction, which will be a key milestone for that particular region in preparation for the World Conference. So we'll have a role in that.
Very good. And you mentioned Thailand. Of course, it hadn't been too many years ago. Thailand had that devastating floods.
That's
that
right.
Wiped out large parts of the area and caused immense damage, human-wise, financially, and also to property. Well, these are all important conferences, and of course, it's good that we're building on the Millennium Development Goals. You mentioned that Sustainable Development Goal and how we need to focus on that after 2015. And we think back to when the UN, the majority of the members of the General Assembly met in 2000 to adopt the Millennium Development Goals on a 15-year continuum to reduce abject poverty by 50%, to promote universal primary school education, to empower women. Number 7 was to promote sustainable development, and there were 4 others too, I won't go into, but those were so critical, and now we're getting close to 2015, December 31st, and we don't want to let them die. We want to continue because there has been a lot of progress made on many of these goals by many countries. Not to say all countries have achieved them, but they're very important. It's very important to keep this moving, and you are going to, I'm assuming you're going to have more input into this Sustainable Development Goal dealing with disaster reduction in the future. Is that correct?
We hope to, certainly. I think that the World Conference on Disaster Reduction in 2015 will be a key venue to figure out how these two conversations link up.
We've got to keep the pressure, or keep the spotlight, I
That's
should
right.
say. That's so
That's
important.
Right.
And to educate people, to educate the public, and to educate the players, the non-governmental organizations, the private sector people, the United Nations agencies. What have you discovered over the years? Well, you've just been in this job for a short period now, I think.
That's right.
And what have been some of your major challenges as you move into this position? I don't know if funding, so often funding is the problem, but I'm sure there are many others too.
Well, resourcing this effort is a challenge, but beyond that, I think it's really challenging to sustain attention on these issues when there's not a crisis happening. Often, the international community comes together, and not just governments, but also the business community and NGOs when a disaster strikes. But what we're trying to do is prepare for the next disaster, knowing that the next disaster is inevitable, but understanding that we don't know when it's coming. And that's really hard to motivate people to do. So that's the hardest part, is just sustaining attention on these problems.
Now, prior to coming to this job, you worked for NOAA, the National Oceanic and an Atmospheric Association or
Administration, yes.
Right, whatever it is, a federal-based operation in Washington, D.C., a governmental agency. And what type of role did you fill there, and how did that help prepare you to move into this position?
Well, I served as the Director of External Affairs at NOAA, and I worked on a number of coastal policy issues, from the White House's Interagency Climate Change Adaptation Task Force to the responses to the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico and Superstorm Sandy here in New York. So I think that it just gave me a better sense of some of the policy dialogues that are happening here in the U.S. And how we might be able to both inform and learn from policy dialogues that are happening globally.
And you mentioned the BP oil spill in the Gulf. You also had worked down there on an equity and inclusion campaign. That's an interesting title. So often we hear Operation Cleanup or something like that. What exactly was the equity and inclusion campaign? And maybe it didn't even focus on the oil spill, I'm not too sure, but what was the thrust of that program?
It actually focused on the recovery after Hurricanes Katrina, Rita, Gustav, and Ike, because it was a very active few years in the Gulf Coast. There was a huge infusion of philanthropic resources into the region, and many new community-based organizations were starting up. But those community-based organizations weren't necessarily connecting with each other. Additionally, there was a sense of competition for resources for recovery among the 3 states, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama, that were most affected. But if you looked at the low-income communities that were also the most vulnerable to the storm among those 3 states, the situation was more similar than it was different. So we got on the road and started building a coalition of these community-based leaders across the 3 states to create a unified policy agenda for an equitable recovery after these storms.
Mm-hmm. And how did that go? Was it successful? Or did you get a lot of input, a lot of people participating? Resources flowing to help the people rebuild?
We had hundreds of participants over just a few-year period, so definitely great participation. And we realized that we were really in the business of building civic infrastructure. And so while we were focused on a policy agenda, I think the most valuable thing that came out of it was the relationships that these community leaders formed across the 3 states. Those relationships certainly came into play again during the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. I was at that time on the federal side, but one of the things that we heard from our colleagues in the federal government was just how remarkably organized and coordinated the community-based organizations in the region were.
Mm-hmm. And very briefly, do you find that there's coordination amongst the various agencies that are out there? I know after the horrific earthquake in Haiti back in 2010, there were thousands of non-governmental organizations came in, but did they coordinate? I know the UN tries to help through OCHA, that office, to coordinate them, but do you find that there's more coordination today than in the past?
Certainly, I think that a lot of people are recognizing the importance of coordination. These are huge problems that we're trying to solve, and no one organization can do it. And so I think there are many players out there who are understanding that it's going to be paramount to their own success to coordinate just across, not just across organizations in their own sector, but with government agencies, with businesses, and other organizations. And so, I think that coordination is certainly improving, but we still have a long way to go.
Exactly. And Jainey Bavishi, we will always have natural disasters. There's probably not much we can do to stop them, obviously, but we can certainly prepare for them, try to have early warning systems set up to help people before they happen, while they're happening, and certainly after they're happening. But I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thanks again for having me.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us on today's Global Connections program.